Okay. Do you want to say anything or can
Do you want me to say anything?
I don't know.
Other than hello,
Sure. Get everyone's attention because you have a loud booming
okay.
voice.
And then you're gonna actually do it from there, eh? So I'll sit here,
Then I'll do my normal.
and when you get to behaviourism, you're just going to say Russell for 5 or 4 minutes. Russell, just those slides. I think you can probably skip the other 2 slides on behaviourism.
Yeah, no, those aren't actually going to show up.
Fine. And then when you've done Piaget, can I then show that video?
Yeah, it's in there.
So that gives 2 little breaks. Right, I think we can start then. We don't have any tutors. I can't see Alex anywhere, can you?
Maybe they're just running late.
Possibly. There is travel. All right. Good evening, and thank you for making it through. I know that central London is still difficult to get through at the moment, but those of you who are here, well done. I suspect 1 or 2 people will come in late today. So welcome to the second week of What is Education. We have a guest speaker, as we will each week from now on, and he'll be arriving for the 6:15 part of the session. And then, of course, after the lecture, we have a 15-minute break, and you go off to your tutor groups. So in this first 40 minutes, Lauren is going to lead us through some of the learning theories that were in the reading. And because I like the sound of my own voice so much, I shall be interjecting occasionally with my own views. Could I say throughout this that if you do have something you feel you want to contribute, then please just signal, and somebody will run to you with a microphone. And by all means, interrupt us. We don't just want to lecture you insofar as we can avoid it. Okay, so over to Lauren.
Okay, so before I start talking about the learning theories, I want to review some things on Moodle because there have been quite a few emails asking questions and they're all about the same thing. So we thought it might be useful to go over where you can find things that you'll need throughout the course. So this is our Moodle page. And so one of the questions that I got several times was about where the discussion forums are. They're in the tab called discussion forums. And you can go in here and then you should know which group you're in. The groups are a little bit more stable this week because people have officially enrolled. So you can check your group at the back during the break. And then if you want to know which distributed expertise week you're doing, which is another very common question, you can just go to the bottom and you'll see all the different tutor groups. And then when you download those, you can look at which reading you're assigned. So another thing is about finding the reading. So if we go back to the home page and you go over here on the right hand side to reading list, CPA. So this is a link from the library to all of the readings, I think all of the readings, or at least most of them. And so then once you're here, you find the reading that you want to download and you click view online over here on the right hand side. And so the readings should all be correct. So hopefully you don't have to worry about that. And you can, find which one. And then there's also another reading list that does it by week, which is available back here. If you go to key information, there's this we schedule, and then also the reading list you can download if you want to know for each week which reading you're meant to do. And then it's also in the weekly session information, which you can access here, and then go to whatever week we're on, like this is this week. And then another question was about the recorded session. So here are the LectureCast recordings. Now, these only come up, they take a little bit because Rebecca, our administrator, edits them, so they won't show up immediately after the lecture. But if you want to go to watch the Collaborate recording for the previous week, so if we go to last week, we can come down here. If you click on the purple arrows, which is the Collaborate icon, then you can look right here, it says week 1 recording, and you can watch that. And that's also quite nice because you can see the chat from the online students going on in the side. So you can see like what they're talking about and kind of see their thoughts on what was being presented. Okay, so those were the key questions that people emailed with. Are there any things that people would like to know where they are or clarification on before we move on to the actual session? No? Okay, cool. So now I can stop sharing. And go, sorry, here, and here, here, and here. Okay, so in this pre-session part, what we're going to do is review some of the learning theories that were presented in one of the readings for this week, the Moore reading. So we're going to kind of quickly go over some of the basics from behaviorism and constructivism, and Russell and I are going to do that together. And then we're also going to think about, as a group, how these different theories fit in with teaching and learning practice in the classroom. So just wanted to start by talking about, I think, well, if you should have all done the reading, Moore mentioned that the theories that he was going to talk about were psychological in nature, in that they looked at how learners develop their thinking, and it's more kind of an internal thing that's going on, and universal patterns of development. So that's something that's very Piagetian, looking at how people tend to develop and through set stages. But there were some aspects of development that were kind of ignored by these scientific experiments because they weren't done in like a natural setting. So that's one of the big critiques of some of these psychological theories of learning. And then another thing that I thought we could think about is kind of the difference between teaching and learning. So if you look at, obviously they're kind of go together, but learning is seen more from what's happening within the student, and it's often like student-led learning and things like that, whereas teaching is obviously teacher-led. And so the different theorists that we're going to talk about kind of approach learning from teaching and learning from very different epistemological standpoints. And yeah. Okay, so Russell's going to start now talking about behaviorism.
Fantastic. Right, I'm going to wander around a bit. So I'm going to speak for about 3 minutes on behaviorism. There is something about behaviorism which I really like. You will have come across this idea. You'll have seen things like Pavlov's dog. Ring the bell, give the dog some food, salivation, ring the bell a few times, it seems to start salivating even if there's no food. So it's been conditioned in some way. Now, what I like about behaviorism, I'm going to wave at Lauren to move the slides around. What I like about behaviorism, even though it is a psychology, and I'm pretty anti-psychology because I'm a social theorist, is that it does away with the idea that the best explanation is what people were thinking. So if you ask somebody why they did something, in behaviorism, that's a waste of time. How could they know? Better is simply to start with the empirical. So the empirical just means what you can see when you put people in particular situations. So the model of human behavior is that in a particular environment, you can stimulate the object of interest, like a human, and they will respond. And you can describe that stimulus in its context and the response without appeal to what behaviorists would say are metaphysical entities, like thought processes or subjects or people with meanings and other monstrously fuzzy ideas. So this is a scientific approach to learning theory, because of course if you stimulate, get a response like that dog, they've learnt something. So that's the first thing about it. I mentioned the environment. Humans act, as do animals, from conditioning. So if you do something repeatedly, it becomes habituated. There are two kinds of enforcement or reinforcement, positive and negative. Here are a few of the heroes of behaviorism. We've got on the right wonders of behaviorism, John Watson, who's an American, and then Pavlov, the Russian, who I've already mentioned. Good. Here is the classical form of behaviorism, which is basically just association. That's the Pavlov dog. It hears the bell, it associates that with food, so it salivates even if there's no food. So simply by an association of contexts, you can teach the dog to do something. In this case, I suppose, to salivate. Just going back very briefly, I do like this picture because there is Pavlov with one of his many dogs. And as you can see, he has created, and this is pause for thought, he has created an environment in which the stimulus and the response mean something. Well, mean something is the wrong phrase. Have some particular kinds of measurable outcome in that context. So of course you may, the old joke is that the dog sees Pavlov coming and starts salivating, so it ensures it gets some food. But whichever way around you read it, that's what's going on. Classical association. So Skinner, who's another behaviorist, American, was quite, back to the pigeon, was quite keen on a different kind of conditioning, this time by enforcing feedback. And feedback of two possible kinds. He electrocuted a lot of animals to teach them not to do things. So in his boxes, there's a box, they often have wire grids on the floor so that the animal gets the message. But also positive feedback. So, of course, you can positively reinforce behavior, and you can watch on YouTube, if you look up Skinner and pigeons, you can see pigeons performing all manner of tricks that they've learned through positive reward. So you can see them, for example, clicking on the red button because that will feed them, and not on the green button because that will shock them. And you can even put words across these, eat and do not eat, and it's as if the pigeon has learnt to read. But you're measuring not what's in the head of the pigeon, you're simply measuring what has been habituated in the behavior of the pigeon, hence this phrase, behaviorism. Now, here's the question for you, just perhaps one or two because I haven't got much time. Here's only an introduction, more time than tutorial. So what? Next slide. So what? If you're a teacher or you're thinking about education, there is a model of human behavior, a continuity from animals to humans. What might it mean? Somebody give me an example of a Skinnerian approach in the classroom, for example. Yes, sir.
If you don't hand in your homework, you get a detention.
Perfect. That's the equivalent of an electric shock. Anyone got the other one? If you hand in your homework, you get... Yes, ma'am. You get a gold sticker. You do. And of course, the idea is that you then associate handing in good homework with positive rewards, and so you're more likely to hand it in. So a huge amount of teacherly and schooly behavior seems to have some reference back to some of these ideas. Of course, the question is this the total explanation? I know one person who believes it is, and she is a very bright academic. So it is possible to write a story about the world, about behavior in general, through the eyes of behaviorism. And as I said, I do admire it for ditching metaphysics. But on the other hand, well, we have to think about it. Okay.
Right. Okay, now we're going to move on to constructivism and talk about Piaget, Vygotsky, and Brunner. I'm going to go over this really quickly because you've already read a lot of this in the reading anyway, but Piaget is probably most well known for his stages of development, which actually Moore didn't talk that much about. But he thought that people went through stages regardless of kind of the environment or our upbringing, that he thought that they were natural progressions of development, that we would go from a very concrete understanding to understandings that were more abstract. And he also advocated a student-centered approach to learning, as opposed to Skinner, who advocated for more of a teacher-led approach, I suppose, in that the teacher was in control of the situation and the stimulus that the students were getting and things like that. And Piaget thought that the teacher's role was to kind of figure out at which stage of development the students were in, and then figure out a way to facilitate them into going on to further stages and build on that understanding. And that's kind of, hence, constructivism is like constructing knowledge through experiences. And so an example of this kind of concrete understanding to a more abstract understanding is like when you start to learn about money. So you might start out with paper money or a representation, a concrete representation of money, and then that progresses on to a drawing of money in a word problem or something like that. And then you might be able to just use like the dollar sign or the pound sign, so that's kind of going from more concrete to abstract in a maths example. Oh, and so now Russell wants to show this video.
Right. So we're going to have a post-Piagetian video, if we can make the technology work. This is one of my favourite tests that researchers did quite a while back now, probably 20, 30 years. And what I'd like you to look at here is to look at this video critically, as if it is research. It's done by academics. I find it quite eye-opening, not only for the result, but also perhaps when you question the methodology.
Oh dear.
One of the things that children need to be able to do is represent internally the complexity of their social worlds. This involves just being able to predict how the world of objects works, but also how other people are likely to react in various situations. Psychologists have recently realized that in order to do this, a young child needs an idea about how people's minds work, what they have begun to call a theory of mind. And research over the last decade has suggested how this seems to appear quite rapidly and suddenly between the ages of 3 and 4 years.
The great thing about theory of mind is that it is a major conceptual tool that allows us to step outside of the bounds of the directly perceivable stimulus circumstances and allow for predicting and explaining other people's behavior in a wide variety of novel ways.
Psychologists argue that we can see the difference between having and not having a theory of mind in simple experiments, called false belief tasks. First of all, the child has to establish the fact that their own belief is false. Then they have to put themselves inside the mind of another child in order to predict that child's beliefs.
Now, Elizabeth, what do you think's inside this box? Have a look inside. Oh, well, let me have a go. Right? You ready? There you go. Go. What's in there? What's that? Oh, right. Should we put them back in the box? Put the lid on. Now, can you remember what's inside the box? And what did you think was in the box? Did you? I'm going to show this box to Jay in a minute. What would Jay think is in the box?
After you've locked up the child's tears because they expect to get sweets, you ask them two questions. One is a reality question to make sure that they remember what's inside. So what is inside the box?
And then you can ask them one of two false belief questions. One is about their own previous belief. What did you think was inside the box? And the second question is, your friend John is going to come and look at the box in a minute. What will John think is in the box?
Like many children of this age, when asked what another child will think, Elizabeth simply projects what she now believes herself about the tube of sweets. She doesn't recognize that the other child exists as an independent, thinking being. And presented with another task of this kind, she acts in much the same way.
Right, now, this is Sally, and this is Anne. Right? Now, Sally comes in with a marble. Sally puts her marble into the basket and goes out. Anne comes, gets the marble. She puts the marble in the box. Here comes Sally. Here comes Sally. Now, where will Sally look for the marble? You got it for her! Hooray!
But for another child, Connor, the outcome is somewhat different.
Sally comes in to find her marble. Where will Sally look for her marble? And where was the marble in the beginning? That's it? Good. Should we look for the marble now? Where did you see the marbles? Have a look. Oh. That's it? Good. The joy of this procedure is that you can ask two control questions to make sure that they understand what the task is about. You can ask them a memory question, which is where is the object at the beginning? And of course the answer to that is at location A. And you can ask them a second reality question, which is where is the object now? Which of course is location B.
To be able to work out where Sally will think the marble is, Connor has to be able to simultaneously hold, or in psychological terms, mentally represent two distinct points of view in his mind. In research studies, most 3-year-olds seem unable to do this.
Before the age of about 4, children do not use the other person's mental representations as independent entities. They do not realize that individuals can act upon misrepresentation. Is this Sally?
But most 4-year-olds get.
Okay, so let's go to Sally and Bob. And I quite like that very last comment, by the way, the child's mental representation. Imagine what Skinner code would say about that. Isn't it? And here we have a model of mental representation. And in the tutorial groups, you might well want to question what was actually happening. You keep interesting questions. Quite a lot of critical literature worrying about what the little girl is really thinking with those questions. So that's the thing about. You'll begin to see why education research is so damn good. Okay.
Okay. So moving on to Vygotsky, who built on the ideas of Piaget. So he still thought that children went through key stages and that they actively constructed their understanding. So he's also a constructivist. But he focused a lot more on the process of learning rather than the outcome. And he also emphasized that that we shouldn't only tailor learning to the stage that children are at, that we should try and encourage them to move on to the next stage, which is what scaffolding and the zone of proximal development is all about. Yes, so, but what that meant, pedagogically speaking, was that teachers had more responsibility to create the right environment and facilitate learning. He also put a lot of importance on the links between language and thought, and that was why he advocated a more dialogic approach to teaching and learning. And this is just a picture of the zone of proximal development. So if you look at, oh, sorry, it got cut off. So the bottom blue dot is new content. So that's a new idea that children are going to learn. But if they do it with teachers, they can understand a lot more than if they did it just on their own. But you also, this is where the role of the teacher becomes very important, because you can't make the content too challenging, because then children get demotivated when they don't understand it. But you also don't want to make it too easy, because then they'll be bored, and so they also won't challenge at all, and they won't engage. Or that's the idea anyway. So as you read in the Moore piece, there are some challenges to Vygotsky, but those are mostly around how other people have implemented his theory. So one of the things that people tend to do is by scaffolding activities, they sometimes close things down and make it more of teacher-centered rather than student-centered. But another thing that I had never realized, even though I studied child development in my undergraduate degree, was that Vygotsky apparently made a very strong distinction between scientific knowledge and the knowledge that you learn outside of the school, like everyday knowledge, which is an interesting connection to Michael Young, who you will learn about later on in the term. So Brunner, again, built on the work of Piaget and Vygotsky, and he kind of, I guess, took in mind all of these critiques, and he focused a lot more on the context in which students were learning things, so looking at why students weren't progressing and things like that, so the cultural things that impacted their ability to learn. Another thing that he contributed to learning theory is the idea of learning as a spiral rather than just an incremental process. So instead of looking at it like stages where you have a base concept and then you build on that and you get further and further along, he saw it more as a spiral. I know this is not what a spiral looks like, but I really liked this image because it showed how they're kind of different, they're cogs and they all work together. So there's a beginning, like a concept at the beginning, and you can build on that concept, which increases your understanding of it, and you can also combine it with your previous knowledge, and that also builds up your understanding. So I thought that was a good picture. So yes, Brunner made a big connection between what went on outside of the school and learning in the school. So he looked at things like how poverty did learning, and also probably class and race and how that affected children's experience, because some had an advantage over others. And I think this is really important because it kind of shifts the focus from explaining why some children don't achieve well to more focus on the social environment rather than their own individual development, so that it's not their fault that they're not doing well necessarily. Sometimes there are other factors that are involved. And that kind of made me think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I don't know if anyone else is familiar with this theory, but basically the idea is that the things that are at the bottom of the triangle need to be met before you can start to think about the things that are higher up in the triangle. So things like physiological needs, like having clean air, having clean drinking water, food, sleep, and things like that are things that you need before you can move on to doing other things like thinking about learning. So if a child comes to school hungry, that could be an explanation for why they're not developing in the normal way that Piaget would consider that. And then another thing that Brunner talked about a lot was motivation, and so the effect that motivation can have on learning. So he, like Vygotsky, saw the teacher as a facilitator, and not someone to just deliver content, but he also felt that student choice and autonomy over learning greatly impacted their motivation to learn. And also made the distinction that if students don't want to learn, that can impact whether they they learn things which seems like common sense. But I guess there was more of a focus on why students weren't wanting to learn and why they weren't progressing.
I want to say one thing before.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, there are two things I wanted to draw upon. You will find throughout this course, right the way up to Christmas, that we are haunted by a particular distinction. It is originally a Vygotskian distinction. It's between what we can do materially in the everyday and learn how to do. I see somebody's about to eat a banana, for example, very good illustration. You know what to do with a banana. Right? Somebody at some point, probably your parents, taught you how to manipulate it. It's not trivial, actually, because it's quite well packaged. So you have to learn a kind of technique. Think of other things like shoelace tying and so on. You can think of those skills as concrete skills because they are intensely material and there's not much to say. You can say a bit, actually, but there's not much to say in the ordinary practice of doing it. Vygotsky's argument is that you push people into school to learn a different kind of knowledge. He called it scientific knowledge. And there, words become much more important, and they depart, for Vygotsky, from the material and become scientific. So teachers are involved in secondary socialization into the complex, discursive knowledges of humankind. Why are we haunted? It sounds like a very simple distinction. But actually, when you look at those complex discursive knowledges, you still have to ask a question, which is, have they actually been cut off from our embodied experience? Vygotsky died very young. He wasn't around to answer questions. So he is appropriated in all sorts of ways. And you'll hear people appropriating him willy-nilly during this course. Everyone has their own take on Vygotsky. He died in his 30s, for God's sake. So think, when you hear people talking about scientific knowledges or the equivalent, there are many phrases that go with it, what has happened to embodiment? The second thing I'd like to highlight from what Lauren has said in her excellent overview is, have you seen here just how many metaphors come into play when you start thinking about education? We have had steps, we've had circles, we've had spirals, and then very nicely we ended up with a triangle. These are not innocent, they have consequences. Pay attention to them when you read and when you discuss. Very interesting to hear how metaphors are deployed in argument. Not simply rhetorically, but as intrinsic to the way arguments are put together. Watch out for the metaphors. Now I think we're going to have a quiz. And because I'm a behaviorist tonight, we have some positive reinforcement, which I got from Marks and Spencer's, and they are, I don't take this literally, dragon's eggs. They are chocolates in a shell, and you can eat them. You will have all of them if you win this quiz.
So just to let you know, we're going to have to, this is going to be a very quick quiz because it's almost time for the break. So there are slides in between each question where I was going to have you discuss it with the person sitting next to you, but we're not going to do that, just letting you know in advance. Okay, I'll give you another minute to join. Does everyone, I'll remind you since this is only the second time we've done it. So basically you go to menti.com and then you have to put in the code that's at the top, which is 886349. Okay. Oh. All right, it seems like we're remaining semi-constant, so I think I'm going to start the quiz. In what way are the theories discussed by Moore psychological? So I'll read, oh, does it say it on your thing, right? Yeah. There is a timer, so you have to be pretty quick. That's pretty good. Okay, so we're not doing that. What does the term assimilation mean, according to Piaget? Ooh. That is a tricky one. You guys can talk about that more in your tutorial. That's one of the questions. Oh, how do people learn without direct instruction? Phew! Oh, what are some examples of how influential Piaget's theory of learning has been on our education system? This was a trick because there were actually two right answers. What is the key characteristic of inquiry-based learning? Very good. Okay, so here are the results. Ooh, Dragonite, that's very fitting.
So who is Dragonite? Hand up, who is Dragonite?
Yay! Okay, so now we're going to have the break, and we'll be back in 5 minutes. So at 6:15, we're going to start. Okay, I think we're going to start now because it's 6:15. So as Russell was just saying, if you didn't hear, you need to sign in, especially if you're on a Tier 4 visa. So remember to do that before you leave to go to your tutor group. And also, so right now there are 2 sheets being passed out. They're double-sided, and there's 4 activities in total. And Adam is going to tell you when we're going to do those in the class. Okay?
So just before we start with this, if you have not got 1 and 2, you need to click on that button.
They're double-sided, so it should be 1 and 2, and then 3 and 4. What about 3 and 4? Does everyone have 3 and 4? Back there. Okay. Okay, great. So I'd like to introduce all of you to Dr. Adam Unwin, who is an associate professor in education with considerable expertise and experience in e-learning and teacher education and professional development, vocational 14 to 19 education, learning outside the classroom, and global perspectives in business and economics education. Along with John Yandel, Adam has a while ago published a powerful little book challenging the commodification of education called Rethinking Education. And as I said on Moodle, it's available to buy after the lecture for £6 cash. So it's with great pleasure I welcome Adam back to What is Education, and he's going to be focusing today on exploring learning and pedagogy. And yeah, thank you.
Can I just put it on the table, or do I need to? No. Hello? Yeah. Okay. Can you all hear me? At the back? Yeah? Okay. All right. Well, welcome to UCL, Institute of Education, and this module. I know you've been on it a week or 2 so far, but I'll just say a little bit about myself. I was a teacher. I was a teacher educator. I still am a teacher educator, and I've also sort of academic researcher. But that's by, I'm not just that. You know, I'm a parent, I'm an uncle, I'm a dog owner, I'm a trade unionist, I'm all kinds of things. Okay, and why I say that is because you will all be different things as well and have different experiences, and that underpins what I'm going to try and cover tonight through some of the looking at pedagogy and learning. So what we're doing, what I'm going to try and do is do this in 2 parts. So we're going to look at learning first. So we're going to look at some models of learning. I'm going to try and make it quite active, where you actually read things and have little discussions amongst yourselves, and then we'll get some feedback, and then we'll go forward and do it that way. Yeah. So I don't want it to be just me standing at the front, or sitting in this case, just telling you, transmitting knowledge to you, and you'll see why that's so. That's the book, and why this isn't just a hard sell. I adapted this lecture from chapter 2 of that book, because I was writing that book with John when the previous module leader said, would you come and do something about learning and pedagogy? So that's why, that's what has got a sort of logic to it. Okay, so we're going to start off with saying, this is a little thing here about that Albert Einstein said, a quote from Einstein, the only thing that interferes with my learning is my education. So what that's really indicating is that possibly, hold on. Yes, well, I want to come on to this in a minute. So what that's really, what he was trying to say there is that schooling isn't everything. You learn in all kinds of ways, yeah? And in some ways he was saying that by going to school it maybe interfered with his education, stopped him learning, because curriculum can be quite prescriptive. So starting with models of learning, if you can imagine this little exchange in a classroom where there are 2 boys talking, yeah? And you know, maybe the teacher's getting a bit annoyed with that. It says, what, you know, so the teacher says, what do you go to school for? And the pupil says, to learn. And then the teacher says, stop messing about with Jamal and get on with what you're meant to be doing. So there's a little exchange there. which has some sort of assumptions in it. That because they're, I suppose one assumption could be that they're talking and therefore they're not talking about something to do with the subject. Yeah. So something that was topic, maybe relating it to their previous experiences. So you've used the more chapter and you've read through that, and of course a lot of that is like Piaget says about frames and schemes of learning and students learning by thinking about their previous knowledges and adapting and adopting and so forth. Okay, and the other thing is, the other assumption I suppose is that learning happens in individuals. That it's not a collaborative process, so they shouldn't be talking to each other. And then that makes an assumption as well that we can have just a transmission of knowledge. Yeah, you can sort of pass knowledge on, and you don't have to. There are not other ways of doing it, and that's got. We'll see that there's some problems with that. But you know, even if we are adopting that transmission method, which we are at the moment, I'm transmitting to you. Teachers use artifacts, because technologies, pens, paper, all those things that help us. You might use your own mechanisms for you thinking, how am I going to take the notes from that lecture and go back and look at them and so forth. So we're going to go on to the first activity, and what I want you to do is read activity 1 and write down what you feel are positive and negative aspects of this approach to learning, and then I want you to talk to 1 or 2 colleagues that are sitting by you. So, but on your own, write them down what you think on your own first, yeah? So just a minute doing that. Read, this is example 1. It's called the history lesson, yeah? So if you read the history lesson, take some notes, and then talk to some people next to you. Think of positive and negative aspects of that approach to learning. Okay, so you should now be thinking about talking to your partners or friends, colleagues, about positive and negative aspects. Okay. Okay. Well done. We've had a good talk about that. So, who would like to give me 2 negatives? Yeah, off at the back. Sorry. Good. Okay. Another negative. Yes. I based it on my 15-year-old experience myself, yes. Okay, positives. Oh, yeah. Okay, so I think just summarizing, saying very structured, yeah? So doing something, reviewing it, and so forth, yeah? Okay, very clear instructions, yeah.
Really efficient way to get facts to pupils.
To get facts, yeah? So a transmission of facts, okay? Just wait till you...
They won't hear you online, so we have to try
Yeah.
and use this.
Connecting the learning to previous, the teacher
Okay,
their learning.
right, yes, there was a, sorry, there was a link to previous lessons, all quite structured. Okay, now I'm not gonna, we could spend half an hour dissecting this lesson, and we've got to get through lots of other lessons. So I noted down some positives, or what might be considered positive, that it's measurable, very controllable, no misbehavior, very structured, there's teacher delivery, they prepare something, one size fits all, yeah, so no difference in assuming any differences within the pupils, yeah. So it actually becomes easier for the teacher, yeah, they just prepare this, boom, yeah. The negatives I noted down were that it relies on memory, rote memory, yeah. That there was no links with wider contexts, or apart from perhaps a previous knowledge in a previous lesson, yeah. But if in history, it's quite often useful to link previous things that have happened with current things that have happened. So so in a way, if we get to the next slide, no, sorry, there we are. What we've got here is that there's a sort of acquiring and memorizing emphasis to that type of teaching, and if they don't memorize it, there's no learning taking place, and therefore it's the pupil's fault. That's the sort of way that sort of happens, the sort of assumptions behind that. Now, we could ask a question, is that a familiar model of learning? Right, okay. Yeah, so I would say, you know, sort of 10 years ago, when I was a teacher, I would spend a lot of time not doing that sort of model of learning. When I first was a teacher, I did a fair bit of it, but then I sort of didn't, yeah, tried to get much more active. So in the UK, there was a sort of movement to more active learning, but I would say perhaps that model's returned to a certain extent. But anyway, most learning is very different because it's all about language, gestures, it's about people, the world, what happens without being at school. Yeah, so it's sort of really these things like social, cultural relationships, the community, work, and so on. So from the moment a child is born, they are learning constantly through their family and their siblings, and so they're quite good learners without going to school, aren't they? Really, they're learning all kinds of things. So I think that's sort of we're looking at that. But the model there was very much about learning facts, yeah, and being able to, you know, reproduce those facts at a later stage. So I think this is quite a good sum up of the where where if we relied completely on that learning, we get that sort of, oh dear, where's it? I thought that was quite good. People get really good at doing tests. Yeah. So that's someone going for an interview after they've left school. Okay, right, now we're going to look at something a bit different now. So we're going to move to, because I talked about the cultural and sort of different types of learning, I want you to look at activity 2 and read that scenario. And this is much more based around what we call cultural learning and so forth. So I'm not going to say too much now, but it's just to set the scene. It was the Yucatan is an area of Mexico, and the indigenous population were called Mayans. Yeah, and these sociologists went and looked at how Mayans midwives learned, and a midwife, you know, is supervising childbirth and so forth. So anyway, read that scenario and then write down what you think the enablers of learning are there, because it's not in a school anymore, not in a classroom. Okay, same procedure. Talk to your colleagues about it once you've written some down. Yeah, sure. Okay, you should be talking to each other about what you think the enablers are now. Okay, we're going to keep going because it's a long evening. But who wants to volunteer some enablers from that scenario? Lauren's got some from online.
One was that the learners are the ones who decide if they want to pursue the subject further, so they have more autonomy and control. And then also, learning is in stages, and they participate slowly and build their knowledge in different ways through discussion, experiences, case studies, etc., until they're ready to progress to the next stage.
Good. They've got much more choice in whether they're participating. Or we could argue they might not have so much choice because their parents say you're going to be a midwife, yeah, whatever. But then, you know, I know people can engage in different ways, even though they're told to do certain things, but we won't go there. Any other things from this audience about the enablers? Don't be shy. Yeah. Okay, yeah. So you covered quite a lot there, but that's very good. So it's long term, it's gradual. Yeah, they're participating in that. So we're going to come to that. Any other points? And then we'll move on. Yeah. Just shout. Yes, yes. Yes. It's very good. So they're constantly going around and they'll be giving advice. So this is I think it's probably best now. I'll get on to what I analysed as the enablers when I was looking at it. Silly computer, sorry. Next slide. Okay. So I thought that the family was really important because midwives, it was a family profession almost. And family is such a big learning environment for children from they're very little. But a lot of the things that they were doing was they were observing, they were watching what was happening. There were lots of cultural practices going on, like rituals and so forth. And there was dialogue. And if you read the Wells article, the Legacy of Vygotsky article, that's one of the readings, they put a lot of store for dialogue. So listening, talking, discussion, asking, clarifying helps people understand things. And there's even Vygotsky went a stage further and said that you could have an internal dialogue. So you don't even need another person there. You can have an internal dialogue with yourself and still it helps you learn. And if you think about that, you do that all the time, don't you? When you're deciding which way to go to the shop. Oh, shall I go that way or shall I go that way? I'll go that way because I'm going to go and past that. Anyway, what's really important in this type of learning is context, I think. And it's something we'll return to later on in this session. But what Leben Wenger did here, they were capturing this and they were calling it a community of practice. And later on in your degree, you'll probably come across this term, community of practice, because it's a sort of a learning theory. And within a community of practice, there are people who are the experts, which like the midwives, yeah, that are really been doing it for a long time, and they're the people called novices. These are terms, and Leben Wenger was sort of saying that this was a type of apprenticeship learning, people learning through their work. And the other term they conceptualized as what they call situated learning, so that you were learning through your situation, and that's as opposed to formal instruction. Yeah, so we can see that this was a midwife these midwives learning. But if you think about other apprenticeship learning, it might be things like plumbers, motor vehicle maintenance, that sort of thing. But you can have communities that would be slightly formalized type of learning. People are going to be a plumber by working with another plumber and then doing the work. So that was what a formal apprenticeship's like. But because Laban Wenger was saying they're these communities of practice, they're sort of like informal. So like a gang, I'm talking about in society, you can have a gang, that's a community of practice. And your friends could be a community practice, and you might have different friends that are different communities of practice. So this was really what they were conceptualizing in this sort of learning. So that's sort of, we've contrasted from very structured schoolroom learning to this learning. Now I'm going to look at something that's a little bit different now, to keep you on your toes. So sorry, this is it just takes a while to. Why does it go? It does up. Right. No. Right. Has it gone blue? It's gone blue on my screen. Okay. So this one is another. This is your activity 3. You've only got to do 4. Don't worry. So this one's a little bit different. This is about mathematics as a concept and about how people learn mathematics. So it's about street mathematics and school mathematics. So what I want you to do again is read this and write down why you think this was happening. Yeah. So the problem's there. You read it, note down what you think was happening, and then have a talk with your colleagues about it, just like you did before. Okay, thank you. Okay, you should be talking to each other now about what was happening. Okay, you're moving on. You're obviously having good talk about this. Is it because maths is such an exciting subject? Right. Mathematics is quite often people have this sort of barrier about mathematics, which is quite interesting about not, oh, I can't do mathematics, that's it. And they sort of go out of it as a teenagers or something like that, or even younger. But anyway, this is looking at these different contexts of maths. So what do you think was happening? Anyone want to sort of explain or have a go? No pressure.
Okay. I'd say it speaks a lot to concrete versus scientific knowledge. So
yeah, good.
The
Very
stall
good.
holders are dealing with concrete experience and they're able to perform calculations in that context.
Yeah.
But the same calculations in a different context, which appears more abstract, they don't know what to do. They literally don't know how to behave.
Yeah. Good. That's a very good summary. So, and I'll just unpick that a little bit. So, concrete, something real that's happening that you live with, a little bit like the situated learning, and then abstract is something that might be something theoretical. Yeah. So that's the difference here. So the pointers that I've just put them up the next slide. So what we got here is the context is really important. So the different contexts of these street boys using mathematical calculations and then going in a classroom. They're very different types of context. And the farmers or the people working on a land compared with being in a classroom be very different. So that's the real and abstract that our colleague just mentioned. But also substantial previous experience of working with in those contexts, the street markets or the fields and so forth. So that's important as a previous knowledge. And that links to situated learning, but it also links to things like Piaget's theory or Bruner's and so forth about previous knowledge. And of course, the situated learning that I talked about just before, it's important, but they would also have grown, that situated learning might have used a lot of trial and error. So we know that shaped field will need that amount of seeds and so forth. And they would gauge things that way. But I think we're moving, as I'm moving away from learning now to the next section called pedagogy. And so the way they were being taught, pedagogic factors, we don't know because nothing in that case study tells us how they were being taught, but it might have been very boring. It might have been really boring, transmission approaches, rote learning. It might have been the teacher might have spoken too quickly. There might have been difficult words. We don't know what was happening there, but that might be a factor. Those pedagogic factors are important. There are other things that affect it. That teachers are usually authority figures, and they might be older. They might have more, almost certainly have more qualifications, different social class. So things like power relations start to impose on learning, whereas the student in this case might feel under pressure, and they might feel this isn't accessible to them, and their self-esteem might be low. I'm sort of exaggerating a bit, but they also might have been given testing, a bit like in the history lesson, where they're having to repeat things back, and they couldn't think, why am I being asked to test this? It's very different. So that's where the abstract and concrete things come. So that's in about 30 minutes. That's learning. We're now going to go on to pedagogy. So, right. Okay, so there's a couple of quotes here. There's a Wikipedia quote, and there's one by Watkins and Mortimer, and they're quite different, really, but they're just really to set the scene. And I'm going to move more on to the sort of complexity of the classroom issue. So they're quotes that you can take with you, think about. the complexity of the classroom, in some ways, this definition is by Watkins is sort of says it all, that classrooms that teachers are having to deal with are incredibly complex, and they say that they are one of the most highly interactive environments in batteries. Oh, that's come back. Has it? Yeah, a bit better. The only one of the professions that's more interactive, more interactions, is air traffic controllers than a classroom teacher. Now, obviously, teachers can control the interactions to a certain extent, but that's why pedagogy matters. Because if you don't think about what's going on in the classroom, it can be very, very difficult. So we're going to use that as a starting point. That transmission that we talked about in the history lesson is a way of reducing complexity. Yeah, so it makes everything easier, structured, straightforward. But learning might be more narrow, and it might be gauged towards certain levels, not other levels, certain previous experiences and not others. So it can be compromised. So what I'm going to do is going to use a framework now, so that you can use it to analyze pedagogy. So if I can get this thing to work, you've got it on one of your handouts. That was, oh no, that was my. There was meant to be 2 Simpsons here, but it's a bit annoying, Lauren. It keeps to. There we are. Can you control it? Do you think it just keeps doing it? Right. So there's there's one classroom. So most of you probably know Matt Groening, The Simpsons, that sort of stuff. Yeah. So I thought that was quite a good one of a sort of, that's meant to be American high school. They're all laughing except for Bart. Yeah. And this is one of his earlier slides. Oh, next slide, Lauren. That's great. Yes, that's better. So I thought this is probably more like the sort of teaching I experienced. So you can see underneath that the desks are arranged in rows, but it just sort of shows you that how complex, and what I like about that diagram is that everyone's doing different things. That might not be very good for pedagogy and learning, but I think you have to sort of think that in typical classrooms, quite often the individuals are quite often all thinking different things, even if they're not doing different things. They might all be pretending to look or whatever. And I like the fact that in this bottom corner, there's a rabbit drawing cartoons. And obviously that was Matt himself way back in his early days. So anyway, I just thought they were quite good diagrams that sort of conceptualize what classrooms are like. Okay, Lauren, next one. What we got here is a diagram or a framework by someone called Kyriakou, who's a teacher educator, which what it does is it tries to provide something so you can think about how things are happening in classrooms. Yeah, and it divides it into process variables, product variables, and context variables. And what the process variables are is what the teacher's doing, what the pupils are doing, and sort of the nature of the activity. So you could use this framework. We could look at this lecture that I'm giving and say, well, what's the teacher doing here? Right, he's doing a bit of transmission, then he's getting them to do an activity. What are they doing? They're listening, they're doing a little activity. And then you could sort of look at the processes that are going on there. And then there are the outcomes, which are the product variables. So all of you will probably get different outcomes out of any learning situation. What tends to happen is that schools, policymakers, governments get obsessed about the process, the product variables, because that's how they measure attainment, and that's how they can say what standards are being maintained and so forth. And they can compare one pupil against another pupil. This one's got an A grade, this one's got a B grade, and so forth. They can also join all those grades together and compare one school with another school. And even, you know, now there's a global comparison of education called PISA, yeah, PISA, where countries are compared and on certain subjects, so that you can compare educational scores in different countries. So there tends to be a sort of obsession by of product variables, but you know that there are also all these context variables. Yeah, so the context variables in a classroom situation aren't necessarily going to be in the classroom, but they affect it. So these are things like the teacher, what age they are, their experience, and so forth. And all these things down here: pupil characteristics, the class characteristics, the nature of the subject, the school characteristics, and so forth, community, and you can go on and on. But these are context variables, and I think it's important to realize they're there because they will affect the process variables. They not affect them, but it's in question how much they do. So I've just sort of introduced that framework because you're going to use it a bit later or you'll try and use it a little bit on a case study I'm going to go through now for you to think about. So this case study is the most transmission method part of the session. Yeah, so I'm going to go through it fairly quickly, but just to give you a gist of what was happening. It was a project I worked on with some colleagues through the British Museum. Yeah, so that's what that is. Yeah, if you haven't been there, that's what that was, that last picture. But anyway, and I'm just going to go through quite quickly. It was a joint project with Deutsche Bank and British Museum, and they were interested they called it Cultures in Contact, and the idea was they were looking at empire and the way globalization had happened over a long period of time. So, and they were interested in getting young people to use the museum as part of their learning about those cultures, getting in contact with each other and so forth. So there were 3 years. There's years 7, 8, and 9. They were London students from London schools, and that means they're sort of 11, 12, 13 sort of age, 14 maybe, that sort of age. And how it worked, they had what I describe as a museum sandwich. So they did activities in school, then they came to the museum, did some activities in the museum, and then went back to school. I'm just going to look at year 8. Yeah, year 8. So year 7, they looked at big empires and civilizations such as the Aztecs, the Chinese and Ming dynasties and so forth, the Romans and this sort of thing. And they were used museum as artifacts to explore some of that, and they used enactors. Someone in a museum who goes and acts in roles and so forth. And year 8, they were looking at the Benin in West Africa, which was now part of Nigeria, or Gambia area of West Africa. I've got a map in a minute, I'll show you. And then in year 9, they were looking at what we would call contemporary globalization, like our corporations' empires. Yeah, is Google an empire? Is Amazon an empire? I don't know, but anyway, that's what they were going. So that's how they did it. But we're just going to look at year 8, and these were 12 and 13-year-olds, and they had an Africa focus. So this is Africa in 1880, and the little bits there, you can look at it in more detail later, but it's showing what bits are owned by. You can see around the edges of Africa, there were the beginning of exploitation by European powers, get settlements and getting raw materials and so forth. So this was before colonialization, so there was pre-colonialization. Okay, next slide, Lawrence. Yeah, so in this museum sandwich,
we did a pre-colonial in the schools, then we did a partition of Africa, which is a big thing in Africa, where basically the European powers divided up Africa, yeah. And then then after, we went back to the school to do colonial life post empire, in the empire, yeah. So that's what we did, and when I'm going to go through part of that so you can see what was happening, and then you're going to try and think about how those variables that I referred to in the previous framework, how they would work here, yeah? Does that make sense? Yes. Well, you're going to have a go anyway. All right. So it started with them doing a role play simulation in the classroom where the students were, each groups of students were villages in West Africa at that time, and they had different resources. Yeah, they had, some of them had, and the resources were things like paper, rulers, pencils, and things like that. And they had to produce. They were natural resources of the village, as well as technologies and things. They had to produce things and sell them to the European agent. And so different villages, some of them were quite rich villages, some were quite poor villages, but their aim was to produce these goods and sell them to the European agent but there was a merchant prince. These were based on what was happening at the Africa at the time. So merchant princes tend to be sort of richer and well-connected people that used to move around this part of Africa, and they would help people and sort of exploit, I suppose. So they became a sort of interplaying sort of person, and they facilitated a lot of that. So what was happening there was that they in a way they were just split into teams to do that. And if you go to the next, oh right, Lauren, you're so quick. Yeah, they were producing, these were the items they needed to produce. Yeah, so there were resources, materials and products supplied by the village, and they were making them out of paper using the scissors, but they didn't all have scissors. Yeah, so they had to trade. Yeah, and the merchant prince helped them trade. So if you look at the next slide, you can see this, just an example of some one group of students doing some cutting out and producing and so forth. They were just in their tables doing that and doing it. So it's very active. They had to move around a lot, and then they would and there were winners and losers in this. Some of them were quite powerful and some of them weren't powerful, but they were they weren't just doing that. Obviously they were briefed because it was the beginning of the project about Africa at that time, and then there was a debrief afterwards about who the winners and losers were, why were they winners and losers, and that resources. And it was sort of, a lot of that was based around trade. Then we went back to the British Museum. Off you go. So this is so if you haven't been to the museum, that's the inside of it. So it's quite interesting. So next slide, Lauren. Yeah, okay. So what they did when they came back to the British Museum is there was in the morning they did a sort of carousel where they went around different galleries, and they could identify items of trade items. So this is a picture from the museum of some European agents with their things that they've got, like you can see ivory there and so forth. So they could actually go and find those items in the British Museum. Then that's all I'm going to say about that. In the afternoon, they all came together for the Berlin conference. So we had a big area which was a bit like this, and there would be 50 students, and they were split into 7 country tables. So you had Belgium, France, Britain, Germany, Portugal, Spain, Italy. They were the people at the Berlin conference, and they were split into those tables. And then they were given, the previous map that I showed. Don't go forward, Lauren. The previous map showed sort of what existing territories were, but they were given supplementary materials like, that Britain wants the Suez Canal area for their trade with India. So they were given sort of, different countries were given their aims of what they were trying to get. So they'd all sit together at a British table and say, what do we want to get out of this? And then those individuals, each one of them would then go to a Berlin conference table. So they would then go and meet with one other person from each country, and they had to negotiate. There were a few of us facilitating this, giving them prods and so forth. But they had to negotiate a partition of Africa, and they had maps, and then they had to divide Africa up as best they could to get what they wanted. Yeah. So and then you can go to the next slide, and then when it was finished, they were they did feedback on their activity, but then they were shown what the partition did actually look like, which I think is that one. Yes, I think it was that one. So that's the partition of Africa map. Yeah, so it shows where the countries are and so forth, and they had to discuss their negotiating techniques and so forth, and how close they got to that or not, what happened into reality. And then they were asked, who was missing from this, and obviously there were no Africans involved, yeah, and they were making all kinds of judgments about dividing up a country, making borders in straight lines through tribes and cultures and so forth. So anyway, it wasn't that was part of the cultures project, is to look at that. So there was that happening. Now, then they went back to I don't know what's on the next slide, Lauren. Do you want to have a? Oh, it's an activity. Okay. So what I want you to do is before you go to the activity, when they went back to their school, they did role plays about life in after that. So we used the British in West Africa, so they were now Queen Victoria was in charge. They had a queen who was their ruler, and then we were talking about post-colonial things and they had role play activities there to do about in their village. So they were getting little scenarios, but I'm not going to look at that because I think I've told you enough now. So what I want you to do is now do this activity. But what have we got? Yes. Okay. So you're going to use this framework that I showed you just now, the Kiriakou one, with the process, context, and product variables. And I want you to think about the cultures project I've just explained you to, and just choose one example of one of the episodes, something that was happening, and try and relate it to one or two of the variables in the framework. Does that make sense? So what you're trying to do is an early stage analytical activity where you're looking at that framework and you're thinking, what was happening in what he was going on about the British Museum project? How could that relate to that framework? Yeah. Okay, so just do that and then have a talk with your partners again about it. Just about keeping on time. Hello. Okay, because we've got to keep on time, and I only asked you to find one variable. Did everyone find a variable and talk to a colleague about it? Yeah? Okay, well, I'm going to, rather than pick up from you, I'm going to go straight to some of the examples that I would say and just explain them a little bit. So, Lauren, if you go to the next slide. Okay, so if we look at these, we've got some of the context variables is we would have students examples of previous knowledge. Yeah, so there are bits of geography and history. Some of them would know more or less about that, but also this underpinning the cultures in contact project was a sort of element of migration and people moving global. Now, because these were London students, a lot of them, their parents and grandparents and even themselves wouldn't have come from Britain. They would have come from origins all over the world. So that might be quite interesting. They had previous knowledge from their own personal experiences. But also the other context variables, the museum and the staff and the galleries and spaces are very different from schools. So that might change the learning situation a bit. And then if we think about the process variables, the two bits that I described to you, the village trading and the Scramble for Africa, which was where they divided up Africa, is quite a lot of group work, getting them to talk, getting them to solve problems, get involved in sort of activities where they are doing things, creating things, using maps, products, and so forth. So there's quite a lot. I would say the process variable is quite active and encouraging dialogue and in trying to get them to talk with each other and work together and teamwork and so forth. And then if we look at the product variables, you've got the geography. There's maybe people would understand more about the makeup, size, location of the African states and so forth. But there's also things about history there, about how imperialism, developed over time. But there's also things about that came up in the village. There was things about trading, business and economic type subjects. But so we could classify them as, if we did a test, we could perhaps measure those, couldn't we? And say, well, right, okay, close your books, draw a picture of Africa before and after Scramble for Africa. And I won't ask you to do that now, but you could do that. You could test it. But there are also other things that might have happened in that, is that there would be sort of teamwork, empathy, confidence, cultural awareness. They're much less measurable than other types of things, but they are still outcomes that could come out of that learning. And I know from my experience when I've involved my own students in visits and trips and things like that, you do get sort of other things that come out which are much more important or useful and long term than some of the sort of prescribed learning outcomes. So we're almost there. Next slide, Lauren. Just to round up, so we got sort of what pedagogy type thing. So we could say that students were active participants and the teachers had moved into a sort of much more facilitator role, yeah? But that doesn't mean that they haven't had to work quite hard here. They've had to plan things really carefully, develop resources that students could use, and they will need to know about the students, who might work well. There's nothing worse than putting people into groups who don't work well and cause problems and so forth. So there's all kinds of things, but there's also the framing of the activities and providing the right balance of knowledge and activities and language that's the right level. And also the teacher is not suddenly not reneging on their responsibilities. Their role is just changing, and they've got to manage the activities, the momentum, and so forth. So we can see, and they get to pull things together. So we can see that teachers' role is much more nuanced, with multiple aspects, and they need to think about the context and process variables. So this is very different from where we started with the history lesson. So that's really what I was trying to say. In 1 hour, I've tried to sort of go through different models and also sort of different pedagogies and so forth. So that's my end point. Thank you very much. You're allowed a break now. I think you're allowed a break now.
Okay, well, we've already thanked Adam, but we could thank Adam again for his wonderful and interactive presentation. And then if anyone wants to buy a copy of his book, you can come up here during the break time.
So they're worth a lot of money. You can have them for £6.
And I'm going to post the slide with everyone's room number right now.
I can testify that the book is
And
worth
if you need to check which group you're in, it should be the same as last week, but you might need to look at the
so the
list.
tutor groups are on the wall. If we could start those in about 10 to 15 minutes, just go there, and if you're doing distributed expertise, that's the first thing that you'll do with your tutor.